Hello everyone, bachphotography here, back with another photography tutorial, so thank you for joining me once again. Today we're looking at mistakes photographers make in the beginning when they're beginners and how you can fix these mistakes in order to improve your photography and become a better photographer. The first thing I see a lot of photographers do when they're just starting out is they'll pick the settings on their camera that they think make a good exposure, and then they won't change the settings on their camera for the entire photo shoot. This is going to be a problem particularly when shooting outdoors because your lighting conditions are going to change dramatically during your shoot. So when you're shooting, particularly outdoors, just check your camera every minute or two, make sure that your camera settings are right, you're exposing correctly for your image, and you won't waste any time taking photos that are way overexposed or way underexposed. Another thing that beginner photographers do a lot, and I do this as well, I'm definitely guilty of this, and it's taking way too many photos and not thinking every single photo through as you're taking it. It makes sense to think if you take as many photos as you can, you're way more likely to get some really nice photos. But what actually happens is you spend a lot more time looking through photos, trying to find the ones that worked out well, when if you just spent a little bit more time posing your model, working out the composition, you'd have a lot of beautiful photos, and you'd have a lot more than you would by just taking a whole bunch of photos and hoping for the best. And a lot of these tips are going to come back to slowing down, just thinking through your shots and being very methodical and accurate with exactly what you're doing with your shooting. Which comes to the next point, which is don't stick into one position when you're doing your photos. Make sure to see all of the available opportunities around you for photos and make sure you're getting the perfect light that you can for your location. Because when you shoot in all directions in a location, you'll see that some of the directions of lighting are way more flattering and just look better in your photos than others. And in this particular instance on the screen you're seeing now, you can see that when we're shooting into this tunnel with this orange light, we're getting a really nice warm image. But when we're shooting outside of the tunnel into the outside, which is much brighter, we're not getting such a flattering image and the light is not as usable. If we're shooting into the tunnel, we can use all of that bright light coming into the tunnel to frame the face, make the face really nice and illuminated, and we lose that when we're shooting outside into that bright sunlight. The next mistake that beginner photographers make is not giving their model enough direction on how they would like them to pose. Make sure if they're doing something that you don't think is working to tell them so that you can get the best photos possible, put your model in the correct position, get the most aesthetically pleasing photos, and just overall make your photo shoot the best it can be. So now you've found a good location, you have the correct lighting, you're posing your model in a good position, and you're trying a whole bunch of different angles to get the best photos possible in your photography. This next mistake is going to make or break your portraits because it is the most important thing, in my opinion, for portrait photography. And that is making sure that your model's eyes are in focus. In portrait photography, the most important thing about a portrait are the eyes. And if the eyes aren't perfectly in focus, you're going to be losing all of the detail and also losing a lot of the emotion and feel of a portrait. Because as humans, we look at people's eyes to get an understanding of how someone's feeling. So if you don't have the details in your photo of the eyes, you're going to be losing all of that potential emotion communication that you would get from a portrait photo. This next mistake is not so much of a mistake, but more of a tip for something you can do when you make a mistake, and that is shooting in RAW. So when you shoot in RAW, which is an uncompressed file format, which gives your photo as much detail as the camera can give you, you have much more flexibility in post-production for changing any of the mistakes or changing anything that you would like to change in post-production, which includes the exposure, bringing up the shadows, dropping the highlights, and also changing color balance and things like that. From left to right here, you can see an original image in JPEG and then an edited image with one extra stop of exposure in the JPEG image in the middle and then in the RAW file on the right. And as you can see in the RAW file, you have a lot more contrast, there's more dynamic range, there's less noise, and also you can just see deeper colors in that photo as well. Another mistake a lot of beginner photographers make is sacrificing their shutter speed so that they can keep a low ISO in their camera sensor. And what they're doing there is they're shooting at such low shutter speeds that almost all of their photos turn out blurry, and they're doing that just so they can keep their ISO low and have less noise in the image. if you're shooting at a good exposure, you won't see too bad of a noise even at high ISOs with modern cameras. And you can always use denoise features and things like that in Photoshop and Lightroom to remove noise in post-production. But what you can't do is fix blurry photos that were taken at low shutter speeds and allowed motion blur into the photo. Before we jump into Photoshop and have a look at some common mistakes that people have when editing their photos, let's look at one more mistake people use when they're doing portraits, and that is shooting at too low of an aperture when close up to their subjects. The closer you are to your subject, the more blurry the background is going to be in comparison. So you don't always have to shoot at f1.8 or f1.4 to blur out the background when you're shooting close up to your subject. And this is particularly true for long lenses longer than 50mm, but even 35mm and wider lenses like that can get very blurry backgrounds when shooting close up to your subject. Before we get into Photoshop and have a look at some of those mistakes, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you are enjoying this content so far and you've gotten this far into the video. I really appreciate it, and it really helps me out making this to a full-time job and making as much content as possible for you guys. So here's the first mistake that I always see photographers make in Photoshop and Lightroom, and that is changing the contrast slider compared to changing the shadows and the whites together. Now this might be quite a controversial thing to say, but I think that using the contrast slider in general is a way too rough of a tool to get a good shadow and highlight in your entire photo, because what contrast really is doing is just changing the highlights, shadows, whites and blacks all together so that you can get a different dynamic range in the photo from the strongest shadows to the strongest highlights. So let's say that I boost the contrast up way too high, like a lot of people might do. The image might look a little bit better, but we're losing a lot of detail up here, for example, and if you go even further, you start losing detail in the highlights as well for this image. So instead of changing the contrast, what we can do is we can change the shadows by themselves first, so we can still get all of this detail at the top here, and then we can also change the whites to be as bright or as dim as we would like separately, so that we can get this dynamic range with more fine tools and not blow out the entire image with too bright highlights or too deep shadows. And this next tip is a similar theme, and that is people changing the saturation instead of the vibrance in the beginning. And I think this is particularly important for skin, because let's say that I change the saturation up even a little bit, even let's say 25 points, you can really see here that the skin is starting to look a little bit strange color, particularly around here, and just in general the entire image doesn't look particularly good for the skin tone. But if I change the saturation back down to 0 and I change the vibrance up a little bit, we can change the vibrance, we can get all the really bright colors to be even brighter, but then the skin tone actually stays nice and skin-like and skin color-like. So that's another tip you can use. Don't jump straight to the saturation, try vibrance first and see if that makes a better difference to the skin. This next one is a big one, and it's something I was super guilty of when I first started photography, and that is just completely overdoing it in Photoshop, going crazy with the HDR, trying to make the shadows look super bright, trying to make everything really pop from the image, and just leaving your photo a complete mess and a confusing mess somewhere where people don't understand where to look, where nothing looks natural and nothing looks normal. Just make sure that when you're editing in Photoshop that all your changes should be subtle and should look like you actually didn't even make a change at all, in my opinion, for the typical portrait. Now this is not always true if you're doing surreal photography or something like that, but in general, in my opinion, if you're doing a portrait and you want it to look natural, make sure that all your changes are subtle enough to look like they were there from the beginning. And finally, don't really worry too much if you're making any of these mistakes or any other mistakes in your photography, because we're always going to be learning, we're always going to be trying out new things, and you're not going to get better unless you try new things, make mistakes, and fail every once in a while. So go out there, make sure that you're taking lots of photos. You don't have to shoot in RAW, you don't have to follow any of these techniques or any of these mistakes. You can really do whatever you want, and you will learn by yourself what you think works for your style, what you think doesn't work for your style, and you will grow as a photographer and always take better and better photos. So let me know in the comments what mistakes you're making most often in your photography. For me, it's definitely over editing photos and taking way too many photos on a photo shoot. I'm also going to leave all of the raw files from this particular photo shoot in the description, so if you'd like to edit some of these photos, feel free to do so, and also send them to me on Instagram. I really like seeing all of the photo edits you do on my photos. I really get a kick out of that as well. So thank you very much for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you did enjoy this video. I really enjoyed making it, and I'd love to know what you would like me to film in the future. What sort of videos do you want me to make? What sort of videos interest you on this channel? So that's everything for this video. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one coming out soon.